As we head into week 5, the wild west of the wide receiver board continues. Some stars are back at the top, others are slipping, and new names are forcing their way into tier 1. Let's break down the top 36 wide receivers for week 5. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings between Jake and Kyle. And for more detailed analysis, be sure to check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted on the channel this week. If you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below, and that's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and an exclusive spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we dive in, we've got a few hits and misses from last week. Let's start out with the hits. What about Emeka Egbuka? He had a ton of pressure coming into the game as wide receiver 1 in Tampa Bay against a tough Philly team. His production warranted a high ranking though, and we put him at wide receiver 15, and he absolutely delivered at wide receiver 8. What about Garrett Wilson? For the first time in 2025, we put Garrett Wilson up inside of tier 1 in week number 4. And listen, it looked bad until the end, but at the end of the day, he finished as the wide receiver 11 with over 17 points. And then Zay Flowers. We talked last week about the inconsistencies of Flowers and why it makes it hard to rank him high on a regular basis. We dropped him to wide receiver 22 and he finished at wide receiver 26. All right, let's take a look at a few of our misses. What about Xavier Worthy? And in a time where it is hard to trust NFL teams with the injury reports, we played it safer and decided to see if Worthy was actually healthy on the field before throwing him up in the ranks. And I mean, he looked pretty good to me. Next up, what about Nico Collins? If only he could find the end zone more. Unfortunately, this week, Woody Marks and Jaden Higgins took the receiving touchdowns, and that absolutely killed Collins. The next miss is DK Metcalf, and we all know that at this point, DK is going to be boom or bust, and week 4 was a boom week, and we just had him too low. All right, so that's it for the hits and misses from week 4. Let's look at week number 5 at tier number 1, and what a shakeup here. We've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Garrett Wilson, Justin Jefferson, Nico Collins, Emeka Egbuka, and George Pickens. At number 1, we've got Amon-Ra St. Brown going into Cincinnati, and he's already the wide receiver 2 on the season, and now he gets a Bengals defense who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. St. Brown has 6 touchdowns over the last 3 games and will have that chance once again this week. At number 2, we've got Puka Nacua, and is this an easy matchup? No, it's not at all. San Fran allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but at this point, it's hard to imagine anybody shutting Puka down. 50 targets in 4 weeks, and he hasn't had less than 118 yards in a game yet this year. He's locked in at number 2. At number 3, we've got JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and last week was enough to cause a little anxiety. Nothing in the first half, and then it looked like we were headed towards disaster, but luckily he got just enough to get us to 10 points in the second half, and they're going to be throwing against Tampa this week, so we're hoping for a bounce back. At number 4, we've got Garrett Wilson, and after a slow start where it looked like Fields didn't even want to throw the ball last week, Wilson came on late and he brought in a super tough touchdown grab. And he is basically the passing offense in New York, and Dallas is the worst defense in the NFL. At number 5, we've got Justin Jefferson, and now we know that Cleveland is one of the best run defenses in the NFL, so the Vikings are going to have to throw most of the game. Now, that being said, it's not like Jefferson has had the highest ceiling this year, so there is a little bit of risk here. At number 6, we've got Nico Collins going into Baltimore. And listen, Nico still hasn't lived up to the production that we all wanted. He's in a role right now where it's big play or bust, and they aren't using him on all levels of the offense. Luckily, though, Baltimore allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so maybe, just maybe, we get that big play in week 5. At number 7, we've got Emeka Egbuka, and he's all the way up to wide receiver 7 overall on the season. He scored 10 plus fantasy points per game in every game this season, but as great as that's been, this may be his toughest matchup yet. Seattle allows the second fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 8, rounding out tier 1, we've got George Pickens. And we are finally getting the production from Pickens that we've wanted for years. He has touchdowns in 3 straight games and has 29 targets over the last 3 games. Now, he does get Sauce Gardner, but he hasn't been shut down at all this year. Now, before we head over to the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all hooked up on Underdog. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so, and then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. Guess what? You're also going to get a first-time deposit bonus and a free player pick'em. And Jake has been breaking down the best peaks weekly in a show on Fridays, and he's been crushing it. So links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week on Underdog Fantasy. All right, let's move on to tier number 2. We've got Deebo Samuel, Quentin Johnston, Davante Adams, Courtland Sutton, Michael Pittman Jr., Xavier Worthy, Keenan Allen, Ted McMillan, and Marvin Harrison Jr. At number 9, we've got Deebo Samuel, and we're still unclear on the status with Terry McLaurin, but we do know that Jaden Daniels is coming back, and that's great news for Deebo. This isn't an easy matchup against LA, but Deebo is used so many ways that they find a way to get him the ball. At number 10, we've got Quentin Johnston, and he's the current wide receiver 4 on the season. He's averaging over 17 fantasy points per game through 4 weeks, and he's had a play of at least 30 yards or more in each game this year. Now, he gets Washington, who allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to receivers. At number 11, we've got Davante Adams, and the touchdown streak is alive in up to 3 games. Now, the volume is nowhere near Puka, but he's averaging the highest yards per reception of his career. The yards are coming in chunks, but be careful. This is no easy Thursday night game. At number 12, we've got Courtland Sutton going into Philadelphia, and another big game for Sutton in week 4. He's now up to wide receiver 11 on the year, and this Philly matchup isn't as tough as it sounds. We just saw Egbuka produce just fine against them in week 4. At number 13, we've got Michael Pittman Jr., and it's clear at this point that he's the favorite receiver of Daniel Jones, but he's had some really tough matchups over the last couple of weeks against teams like Denver and the Rams. Now he gets Vegas, and they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 14, we've got Xavier Worthy, and it was awesome to see Worthy back and healthy. We know that these days it's impossible to trust NFL injury reports, so we just wanted to hold our expectations last week to see if he was really healthy. Well, he sure looked healthy to me, so fire him up against Jacksonville. At number 15, we've got Keenan Allen, and it was a down game in week 4, but he still had 7 targets. And this was more of an issue of the Giants' defensive front pressuring Herbert too quickly. Expect the Chargers to make adjustments and for him to have a better game in week 5. At number 16, we've got King Ted McMillan, and the biggest thing missing for him this year is touchdowns. He's literally 1 touchdown away from being in the top 24 and 2 touchdowns away from being inside the top 20. Well, now he gets a matchup against Miami at home in Carolina, and I think that's fitting for his first touchdown. And then rounding out tier 2, we've got at number 17, Marvin Harrison. And everybody stay calm, but Marv just had 10 targets in week 4. Only the 4th time in his career that he's seen that many. And let's hope that that was enough to break the seal and that he can be more consistent moving forward. The Titans do allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. All right, that's it for tier number 2. Let's look at tier number 3. We've got Jamar Chase, Brian Thomas Jr., A.J. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Jameson Williams, Zay Flowers, Chris Godwin, Chris Olave, and Jordan Addison. At number 18, we've got Jamar Chase. And I just have one question. Why haven't the Bengals brought in Jameson Winston? They are just wasting money that they're paying Chase and Higgins because Browning cannot get them the ball. They have to throw weekly, but most of it isn't even catchable. It's crazy to see him at 18. At number 19, we've got Brian Thomas Jr. And going into week 5, and BTJ has yet to have more than 56 yards in a game, and his only touchdown on the year was a rushing touchdown. The targets are great, but if they don't turn into receptions, it's just an excuse. And now he's got another tough matchup against Kansas City. At number 20, we've got A.J. Brown. And let me ask you, who's enjoying A.J. Brown in 2025? This is actually worse than we could have imagined. He's had less than 30 yards in 3 of the 4 games this year, and now he gets Patrick Surtain and the Broncos, who allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers on the year. At number 21, we've got Jalen Waddle, and the injury to Tyreek sucks, but it has to boost the volume going the way of Jalen Waddle. Now, this isn't a one-man show in Miami, but the big play option in this offense will more than likely be Waddle for now. At number 22, we've got Jameson Williams going into Cincinnati, and he's coming off a season high in targets with 8, but he only had 2 catches for 40 yards. Once again, Detroit got up big, and then they didn't need him. But let's hope for that big play once again against one of the worst defenses in the NFL in the Cincinnati Bengals. At number 23, we've got Zay Flowers, and Flowers is known for being inconsistent, but now what can we expect without Lamar Jackson? How much does Cooper Rush spread it around? And then there's the fact that he could have Derek Stingley on him this week. And for us, there's more red flags than that guy from high school who Facebook messages you about a business opportunity. I'm talking to you, Colby. You know who you are. At number 24, we've got Chris Godwin going into Seattle, and 10 targets in his first game back was a shock. Now, obviously, it didn't translate to yardage, but you have to think that each week he gets closer and closer to true game speed. Now, it's not the easiest matchup this week, but that volume is very intriguing. At number 25, we've got Chris Olave, and we saw a massive drop in volume in week 4, which is weird because they trailed Buffalo. Luckily, he was able to find the end zone, and he just needs the offensive line to block long enough for Rattler to find him down the field this week against New York. At number 26, we've got Jordan Addison going into Cleveland, and 8 targets over 100 yards in his first game back. It was a great thing to see. And you have to think that he sees similar volume this week since the Vikes are going to have a hard time running in Cleveland. All right, that's it for tier number 3. Let's look at tier number 4. We've got Jakobi Meyers, Stefon Diggs, Khalil Shakir, Ladd McConkey, Devontae Smith, Trey Tucker, Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, T. Higgins, and Keon Coleman. At 27, we've got Jakobi Meyers going into Indianapolis, and Meyers has had a lot of empty volume in 2025. He just can't seem to find the end zone or rack up enough yardage. And he'll get a good chance against Indy this week, though, since they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 28, we've got Stefon Diggs going into Buffalo, and it sure looks like he's getting healthier, and he just played over 60% of the snaps for the first time all season. Now he gets a revenge game against Buffalo, and you have to think that he gets a chance to stick it to Buffalo. At number 29, we've got Khalil Shakir, and with as much as Buffalo spreads the ball around, Shakir has lucked out the last 2 weeks by getting a touchdown in each game. We're hoping that New England and the offense can score a time or two and keep Buffalo with their foot on the gas pedal. Coming in at number 30, we've got Ladd McConkey, and 1 catch for 11 yards in a game that he played in 92% of the offensive snaps. Absolutely insane. He's played in 87% of the offensive snaps on the season, but he's only averaging 4 receptions for 43 yards a game. The matchup is great, but the production is just not there. At number 31, we've got Devontae Smith, and he's also a victim of the inept passing game in Philly right now. Smith has yet to top 60 yards in a game this season, and with as little as Philly throws the ball in a tough Denver matchup, it's just going to be really hard to trust him in week 5. At number 32, we've got Trey Tucker going into Indianapolis. And guys, this one's really all about the matchup and the hope of another big play. Indy allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and Tucker only needs 1 big play to have a solid day. At number 33, we've got Wan'Dale Robinson going into New Orleans, and no more Malik Neighbors, so obviously there has to be more targets going the way of Wan'Dale. We also know that Jackson Dart is there to throw the football, and it all comes down to whether he's a check down guy or if he decides to go vertically down the field. At number 34, we've got Darius Slayton on the other side, and you have to think that he sees more volume, but he's also going to see more defensive attention with Neighbors not on the field. That alone is going to make him pretty big big play dependent, but New Orleans allows over 28 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. And at number 35, we've got T. Higgins, and we've got to expect Detroit to get a lead, and Cincy will be forced to throw, but that's been the case since Burrow has gotten hurt, and it's still turned into absolutely nothing. This Bengals situation, it is tough. And then rounding out the top 36, we've got Keon Coleman. And Vegas has this game projected as the highest scoring game of the week. So why not include the big play guy in the offense and hope that it's his turn to find the end zone in week number 5? So there you go. There's your top 36 wide receivers at tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a couple guys on the outside looking in: Troy Franklin, Alec Ayomanor, Calvin Ridley, Travis Hunter, and Cooper Kupp. And that's how the wide receiver board shakes out for week 5. And we got to know, who's your must-start wide receiver this week, and who are you nervous about? Let us know in the comments. We're going to answer as many questions as possible. And as always, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on the rankings videos all season long. Headliner Nation, we'll see you in the next video.
Analytics off the chain, other channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.